Okay, good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay. Excellent. So, we're going to have this canter through school budget mastery. I'll say from the outset, there's no silver bullet. These are practical tips. As we go through the slides, if you want me to pause, if you want to ask questions as we go, very comfortable with that, and we'll see where we get to. Okay, so we're going to start off with financial planning and value for money, what you need to have in place, what to look out for, and how you develop your strategic plan. Is that what everybody's expectation of this session was? You okay with that? Good. So I'm going to start with 10 things that you should be fully conversant with, that should encourage your leadership teams to engage with. So that's SLT, certainly the head teacher, the chief executive, governors and trustees. And I think collectively you need to own these numbers. So it's not just the job of the finance professional. Everybody should understand, first of all, what the numbers are and why you're at the levels that you are. So, starting from the top, staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure. Pretty straightforward, really important. Average teacher cost. Pupil-to-teacher ratio, often known as PTR. The size of your classes. And in fact, I'd go a bit further than that. The size of the classes and also the environment in which teaching and learning is taking place. So that's space allocation. Teacher contact ratios. The proportion of budget spent on the leadership team, the 3 to 5 year budget projections, and I know many of you will say, we can't do 5-year projections because we don't have budget certainty. And that, in its own way, it is a legitimate response. But actually you have far more certainty than many organisations, certainly outside of the public sector. And yes, of course, you're going to have to make assumptions, and you're going to have to make informed assumptions. You're going to have to make assumptions around pensions. We know that there's a local government pension valuation coming up shortly. You're going to have to make assumptions about that. Hopefully, once we get past this political uncertainty, you'll have a bit more certainty so that you can plan more effectively. But you've got to start to think about, not just what's going on this year, even next year, certainly 3 years, and ideally 5 years, and start to build that. And it's not set in stone. A 5-year projection will adjust, just like as you review your own budgets, hopefully on a monthly basis, certainly on a quarterly basis, you'll make adjustments, and you may go back to your trustees, to your leadership teams, and say, actually, given what we now know about the budget, we want to recast it. Well, you can do that for the 3-year budget. You can do it for the 5-year budget. So it is the art of the possible rather than the impossible. Spend per pupil for non-pay expenditure lines compared to similar schools. And I think the similar schools thing is important. You won't necessarily find that by plugging your data into the national benchmarking tools. I mean, do that by all means, and in its own way you'll find some of the information quite useful. But you probably know more about your own local environment, and actually if you've got a good relationship with your local schools, if you can do those kind of comparisons, again, it's really quite helpful. Your school improvement plan priorities and the relative cost options. So school improvement shouldn't be sitting out as a siloed activity. It should be fully integrated into your strategic thinking, and the way you deploy resources to that, absolutely central. And then finally, a list of contracts with costs and renewal dates. And again, apologies if I'm teaching you to suck eggs here, but I often see schools that have multiple contracts and they're just rolling on the contract year after year, and they don't go back and, first of all, don't test the market. They don't even look at the contract and say, actually, does this represent value for money? Could I do better? what's it costing. So it's really important to have a system that will first of all alert you to those contract renewal dates, and then to do the kind of forensic thinking around how can we do better. If indeed the conclusion to that is that where you are is okay, well, that's fine, but at least you've reflected. So in terms of applying the 10 checks, I think it's really important to use these 10 checks early in the budget planning cycle, and then certainly when we talk about the 3 to 5 year position, kind of doing that anyway, because if you're building assumptions in for something that's going to happen in 5 years' time, that's quite a nice lead-in. But make sure there is a proper period of time to reflect on how you build your assumptions up, and what we don't want is budget planning right up to the wire, where people are having to make decisions on the hoof. We want to plan a process which gives you that time to properly reflect, to do any cross-referencing, to do any triangulation of your thinking, for that matter. I keep banging on about this. I've already done one presentation and I've talked about it. I've got about another 5 to do over the next 2 days. It's going to keep coming up in all my presentations, because I believe joined up leadership is absolutely central to successful schools and trusts. And what I mean by that is pedagogy, governance and business working seamlessly together, not in silos. So if you're a finance professional, you're not just creating your the budget in isolation. If you're designing the curriculum, you're not doing that without reference to the resources that are available to you. And if you're a governor or a trustee, there isn't proper challenge in terms of the assumptions that are being used. So that joined up piece, really important. Compare your school spending with other schools in similar circumstances, and as I've said, you can do that via the DFE benchmarking, or you can do it by building a relationship with local schools in your area. But remember, you don't ever have to be a slave to numbers. What comes out of benchmarking, what comes out of the resource management toolkit, when you're looking at efficiency metrics, when you're looking at the ratios that I talked about earlier in this presentation, know where you are and defend your position. And if you're a bit of an outlier, but you can defend the reasons for it, that's absolutely fine. Not knowing your numbers and not being able to defend the decisions you make, I think, is inexcusable. So when schools to me say, I've done everything I possibly can in terms of efficiency, I'm the most efficient school in the country, there's nowhere else for me to go, my first question would be, well, talk to me about your numbers. And if the answer is I don't know my numbers, then I will say, I'm sorry, I don't believe you. So know your numbers, defend your position. Okay, so let's walk through each of those 10 checks that I suggested. So staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure. It won't come as any surprise to you that staff pay is the single most expensive item in a school budget. And typically it represents over 70% of expenditure. So we should understand why we're spending that money, how we're deploying talent across the organisation, and does it reflect the ambition that we have and the resources available to us? From a governor perspective, the kind of challenge you would expect to receive from your governors should be what percentage of the budget is spent on staffing compared with similar schools? How does the percentage for teaching staff, curriculum support staff and other support staff compare with other similar schools? Now so I've taken this from a governor perspective. If I was a governor or a trustee, that's the question I would be asking my school business professional in this area. What you need to do if you're a school business leader is have the ready-made response to that question. Staying on this same item, staff pay as a percentage of total expenditure, how do your school's pupil outcome, that's progress, compare with other similar schools? So So in terms of the return on investment, the amount of money that you're spending on staff, what do pupil outcomes look like? Understand that relationship. What's the overall cost of staff as a percentage of total income? And if your staffing costs are over 80%, I would argue that's very high. Now, there could be good reason for it, but for me that would start to set off some alarm bells. If I was a trustee or a governor, I'd be wanting to get some robust responses if that's where the levels were. And if teaching costs are relatively high, is this due to the number of teachers, or is it about salary levels? So not about numbers, but about the pay, the remuneration of individuals within the organisation. And again, if that is the case, it's about high pay, is there good reason for it? Are you in an area of the country which makes it really difficult for you to retain good teachers, high quality leaders, and you have to pay a premium for that? And if that's the case, and that's the price you have to pay for improving children's outcomes, then there could be good reason for it. But again, know your numbers. Average teacher cost. And this is measured by dividing the total teaching cost by the full-time equivalent teachers. A straightforward calculation. And you might want to be ready for the following question. If the average teacher cost is high in comparison with other similar schools, why is this? And is it due to any of the following things? The staffing grade profile, such as a high number of staff on the upper pay scale, and that's very common. So where we see high levels of retention, teachers that are having or enjoying their experience in a particular setting and have been there for 10 or 15 years, and the school has held on to those teachers, what you're going to see is that over that period, they've all moved up through the pay spines. They're all on the upper pay scale. Almost all of them will be on some kind of teaching and learning responsibility point. Some may be enjoying honorarium as well. And again, it's a very tough question to be faced with as a head teacher when you're looking at balancing your budget. If that quality, that caliber of workforce is making a huge difference to your institution, are you really prepared to make the difficult decision of looking at a way of removing that cost burden? Some of it will come through natural wastage. Some of it might be some difficult conversations and recruiting in more junior members of staff. It's very difficult. But the difference between a school with that kind of profile and a school that's got a high level of NQTs, some in the middle of their professional journey and some on the upper pay scale, versus a school which is almost exclusively got teachers on the pay scale, the budget impact is massive. But again, understand your particular context and make decisions, informed decisions about how you're going to tackle that. And then the responsibility structure in the school, and that's more than just TLRs. It's about management. How many managers do you have within the organisation? Do you have what I refer to as a bloated leadership team? Do you have lots of leaders on high salaries that are not in front of children very often, if at all? And again, you need to reflect on your own particular context. Moving on, pupil-to-teacher ratios, often referred to as PTR. And this is calculated by dividing the number of full-time equivalent pupils on roll by the total number of FTE teachers. A relatively low PTR could suggest small class sizes. As well as benchmarking the PTR, you may want to review the average PTR and pupil-to-adult ratios and look at that across other schools and academies. The ratio of pupils to all educational staff is also relevant, particularly for primary. This is a bit contentious. We did some work on teaching assistants, and if you look at some research that the the endowment fund have conducted, there is the correlation between high levels of teaching assistants and pupil performance. Well, the evidence isn't there. So I think it's important to reflect on the value that, I'm not suggesting for one moment that teaching assistants aren't important, because they are absolutely important, but the level of teaching assistants, the number of teaching assistants, and the correlation with outcomes, I think you need to look very carefully at that and make your own determination. So the kind of questions that might be thrown at you if you're constructing a budget: what's the PTR for different key stages within your organisation, within your school? How does the school's PTR compare with similar schools? Again, there's national benchmarking you can do, or you can collaborate with local schools and get what I believe would be a more meaningful response. And how does the ratio of pupils to staff compare with similar schools? Class size, again, really important. We can all square the budget by chucking 80 children into the main hall and teaching them rote. That wouldn't be ideal at all, surely. But there is a balance. And again, I think there is the evidence that is out there that suggests a class of 24 will achieve better outcomes than a class of 28. I'm not sure that the evidence is there. And I know we've been very careful to make sure that we don't end up with class sizes which are unmanageable. And what is the sweet spot in terms of a class size? I can't give you that number, but I think it probably is reasonable between a number of 24 and 30. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that either is better than the other. So again, think carefully about that. Look at the average class size by key stage and the options that are available for children at key stages 4 and 5. Again, we want a breadth of curriculum, we want a broad, rich curriculum, and we don't want to undermine that. But at the same time, we do need to think about viability and what's the opportunity cost if we end up with some subjects where there are such small class sizes that it becomes difficult to make the case. And what class size does your school aim to achieve, and what's the reason for that? So have you notionally decided that you're never going to have a class above 28 or above 30 or less than a certain number? What's the reason behind that? Is it evidence based, or is it just kind of intuitive? Again, I think it's important to know the answer to that. Are there any small classes where the pupil funding does not cover the cost of delivery? Now, this is a difficult one, because going back to that question of a broad and rich curriculum, there may be circumstances where it's not just about the cost of that particular lesson, but it's about the learning experience, it's about the opportunities for the whole learning community. And it may be that other activities, other lessons, other funding needs to cross-subsidise that activity. But just make sure you understand what the reasons are for keeping a particular class or a particular lesson or a particular subject going. And then, do you know the maximum average class size that the school can operate at, given the context and the pupil admissions policy? Again, all things that you need to build into your considerations. Teacher contact ratio. This measure is calculated by taking the total number of teaching periods timetabled for all teachers in the school and then dividing that by the total possible number of teaching periods. All teachers have a guaranteed minimum of 10% time for planning and preparation. Therefore, the teacher contact ratio will always be lower than 1. So if you're wondering why you've seen that before and you thought, it's always lower than 1, that's why, because that needs to be factored in. Again, questions that might be thrown at you: How would changes to the teacher contract ratio impact on the overall budget? Are teaching staff undertaking roles that could be done by support staff? Really important. We don't want people, particularly talented individuals within an organisation, distracted by tasks that other people could do. And the worst culprits for that are the most senior leaders in our system. It is bizarre, but it's true. How many times have you sat in an SLT meeting where the conversation has centred around how we're going to set up the school play, the assembly, the sports day, or whatever it might be, and actually, time isn't being spent on the proper strategic elements? How many times have you seen a deputy head of curriculum, head of school improvement, rekeying data from one spreadsheet to another? It's not the best use of individuals' time. So let's make sure we deploy people to the right tasks, and we absolutely get the best return on investment for the talent we've got available to us. And then linked to that is, how does your school compare against ICFP national benchmarks? And we'll come on to ICFP a little bit later on. I don't need to tell you that schools have many different approaches to the way they structure themselves, and the amount of money that they spend on central teams, or the way indeed that they construct their leadership teams. So in some cases, you might have quite a lean leadership team with a head teacher that's very hands-on, and that's probably appropriate for a smaller primary setting, where the school really can't enjoy the luxury of key members of staff not participating in pedagogy. And then conversely, when you start to scale up structures where you have multi-academy trusts that are looking after 30, 40, 50 schools, clearly the chief executive's role in terms of frontline delivery is, it's not negligible, it just doesn't exist. They have a very executive function which is completely detached from frontline teaching and learning. But it needs to be proportionate. I did come across a primary school with a pupil roll of less than 500, and the structure went like this. It had chief executive, so it was a SAP, by the way, it wasn't a multi-academy trust, it was a standalone academy, primary, less than 500 on roll, chief executive, executive principal, 5 deputy heads, 7 assistant heads, an accountant, and a school business leader. It's published, it's out there. I mean, so, I'm not going to reveal the school, but it was out there. Clearly, that is totally disproportionate. So, we've just got to make sure that we have a leadership structure, a structure which is appropriate for the particular context that we're dealing with. And then there's this whole conversation, and it's interesting because I don't think we've really bottomed it out. I've certainly had lots of conversations with officials at the department about how we calculate non-class-based leadership, and what do we mean by that? So when we're looking at the percentage of teachers as an overall cost, the percentage of teaching leadership as an overall cost, the percentage of overall leadership, the percentage of overall cost, do we chop the head teacher in half? Do we do some apportionment? To what extent is the chief executive the leader of pedagogy in a trust environment? So depending on how you treat those individuals and the effort they're making in any particular area of the organisation, the data will be skewed, and there isn't consistency in the system. So when we're doing benchmarking, it's very difficult to arrive at the right number. I would recommend that the amount of resource that is being deployed exclusively to pedagogy, and that the resource that's being exclusively deployed to overall leadership and management. And then if you want to use any of the other metrics, you can, but at least you've got a handle on the spend that's taking place in those important areas of your activity. Questions that might be asked of you if you're developing your budgets. Again, how does this compare with similar schools? taking into account any contact time the leadership and staff have. If there's more than one school in your trust or federation, are the structures proportionally the same? How has your school made decisions on the proportion of its budget to be spent on the leadership team? Conversation we've just had. And is this relatively high or low compared to other similar schools? Again, without being a slave to national data, but understanding whether you are part of that best fit line or whether you're an outlier. I'm not going to dwell on this. We talked about this a little bit earlier, 3 to 5 year budgets, and of course the pushback will always be we don't have certainty. Well, you perhaps have more certainty than you think. I think you do need to be courageous with your assumptions. When I say courageous, I don't mean overly optimistic. I just think you need to, you stick your head above the parapet and say, actually, given the evidence I've got, this is where I think we might be in 3 years' time, and you build in a sensible contingency. Kind of questions that are going to be asked of you if you're preparing your 3 to 5 year budget. How confident are you that pupil number projections are realistic? It is the pothole that so many schools fall down on. Overly optimistic pupil projections, not having a plan B if those pupils don't arrive at the school, and how much certainty can you offer the board in terms of cautious, likely and optimistic? Again, stating the obvious, if the cautious budget indicates potential financial difficulties, what contingencies do you have in place to overcome them? It's the plan B. Maybe you even need a plan C. You do need to build these scenarios up, and I think the further out you get, the more you need to think about potential scenarios and adjust as you get closer to more certainty around what's coming. And then think about how decisions today will impact medium and longer term ambitions that you have for your trust or school. Okay, on to 8, we're getting there. Spend per pupil for non-pay expenditure lines compared to similar schools. You might want to ask, what is the spend per pupil for catering, ICT, estates management, business administration, energy, curriculum and supplies? These are obvious questions. I think when you're planning your budget, there are 3 things you've got to have in mind: curriculum ambition and your red lines in terms of what you're prepared to concede, your operating costs, which includes all of these things, and the grant income that you expect to receive to fund those 2 activities. If there's a shortfall, so if funding doesn't meet your curriculum ambition and your operating costs, it's about prioritisation. It's about making those difficult decisions. And then ask the question, are the reasons for particular challenges unavoidable, or are there further efficiency savings that are possible? I actually don't like the word efficiency. The department have rode back from it. We talk about resource optimization, and I think that's better language. I think what we should be doing is making sure that resources that are available to us we're using in the most appropriate way. So in fact, rather than looking for efficiencies, it's just asking the question: am I deploying the resources that are available to me in the best possible way? Some other things to think about: cost of energy. I mean, we could go on in terms of procurement. Energy is obviously a big ticket item. I think if you haven't looked at energy for a number of years, you should do so. You should do so at the point of renewal, but you should also look at what schemes are out there available to you to make significant savings, and there are many. The investment on learning resources, in some cases, what I've seen is a fixed capitation for all faculty areas year on year. and really we should be thinking about what are the needs in a particular given year of a particular faculty. If a faculty can make a really strong case for additional funding, and it needs it to ensure pupil outcomes, and that means that other areas have to concede in that year, then you should be at liberty, you should have the flexibility to do that. In the forthcoming years, other departments will enjoy extra funding if they need it. I think a blanket approach to just throwing cash at departments year on year without doing a needs-based analysis, I think is a bit of a mistake. And then this is contentious, just talking very quickly about top slice and gag pooling, particularly in multi-academy trusts. A lot of trusts, particularly those that middle to large in size, are taking a management fee, a levy, whatever you want to call it, from local schools to run central services, or in some cases they're gag pooling, so they're taking all of the funding into the centre and then allocating it out to the various schools. Now, some who are opposed to gag pooling would argue that whilst we're striving to a national funding formula, suddenly we allow schools or trusts to gag pool. Doesn't that defeat the object? Those that are in favour of it would argue that actually pupils attract a level of funding, and it's up to the trust to make sure they are delivering the best outcomes for a community of learners and not for one individual school. So that debate rumbles on. Gag pooling, top slicing, the level of the top slice, what's appropriate, what's not. I think at the centre of that is ethical leadership. If you've got, if the executive team are absolutely committed to making moral judgments, and their moral compass is where it should be, if they get the local schools on board, and if it is genuinely about improving the outcomes for a community of learners, then those things can work. If there are other motivations for gag pooling or squirreling funds away, then of course that's going to be subject to quite heavy scrutiny. Okay, school improvement plans and the relative cost options. Again, I'm going over old ground, but the budgetary process needs to sit firmly with the strategic leadership team and the framework, and should link to the overall objectives of the school or trust, and the conversation needs to be properly joined up. Pedagogy, business, governance, all involved in the conversations, all challenging each other to make sure that decisions are made robustly and in an inclusive way. And then finally, got through the list of 10 contracts and renewal dates. I recognise in the busyness of our daily lives that when we've had a relatively positive experience with a provider, it's easy just to let that contract roll on year. But we can get caught out. One, we can get caught out because we miss an opportunity to release resources that we can put somewhere else. We shouldn't allow providers to become complacent, so we need to keep pressing them for the best deal. And we need to test the services and the price with other providers. So there needs to be a systematic approach to looking at contracts and saying, okay, that was the service we had, that was the price we paid, how can we negotiate with this provider to make sure that what goes forward represents value for money, is commensurate with what's going on elsewhere in the market, and we haven't missed an opportunity to use those important resources somewhere else. So I think it's important to pay attention to that item. So there's a list of 10. It's pretty straightforward stuff. I told you at the start of the presentation, it's not a silver bullet. If you follow those steps, I think you can't go far wrong. And certainly I'd be encouraging trustees to be challenging against those 10 checks. We've got a bit of time, very quickly. I'm going to skip over this because we've already talked about joined up leadership. I do want to mention ICFP. Can I ask by show of hands, who has integrated curriculum and financial planning embedded into their practice? Okay, so that's not very many. I mean, I'm guessing, but about 10% of the delegates here today. How many are interested or contemplating how they embed it into their school? Right, okay, that's good. And who thinks it doesn't work at all? Okay, well that's interesting. So we've got about 10% have it embedded, 50% are interested in embedding it into their schools, and we've got about another 30% that are abstaining in terms of having a view. So that's fine. So look, integrated curriculum, financial planning. It's not new. It's not a new concept. It's become very fashionable. The Minister, Lord Agnew, really thinks it's transformational for schools, and the reason he thinks that is because it absolutely made a difference in his particular trust. And there is lots of evidence out there to suggest that if you understand the numbers, if you do have an integrated approach to curriculum design and your financial planning, then you can go a long way. There are many providers. Organisations that you may have heard of in the past include ASCL, OGAT, SIPFA, Capita. There are many out there, many iterations. But they all do this, ultimately they all do the same thing, and they ask fundamentally the questions in some way or another. They ask the questions that I went through earlier in the presentation, and at a very basic level, it uses a reasonably simple set of metrics to assist with collaborative decision making. I mean, that's essentially what it's about. There's no prescribed way to do it, but there are several well-established approaches. But it does provide some really important analytical information that will really help with your decision making, and in essence, fundamentally, what it will do is bring those pillars of leadership together: business, governance, and pedagogy. Really, really important. What's it measuring? So I'm not going to go through that whole list, but you'll see that what the tool does is look at a series of balances, and then use a series of metrics, and through a series of predetermined formulas will kick out a number of values. Now, the Institute have developed what we believe is a very accessible tool. So as I mentioned to you before, there are lots of tools out there in the market, some well established, some not so well established. Some of them are very forensic and very technical, and if you're not a qualified accountant, if you're not a supernumerate, if you don't like Excel, then they're quite difficult to engage with. What we've tried to do as an institute is develop a tool which is accessible to those pillars of leadership, to governors, to trustees, to pedagogical leaders, to heads of faculty, and the conversation led by the school business leader, the school business professional. And we think we've achieved that by really boiling it down to these few metrics, and then setting them, and apologies for this, I'm not sure how easy it is to view there, but essentially what you've got is you've got a series of outputs given that data that I showed you in the previous slide, and then you've got a range of red, amber, green. So if you plug the numbers in and you end up as an outlier, a significant outlier, then it will flag up as red. If you're within a sensible range, it'll come up as amber. And if you're bang on, if we're where we would expect you to be, it'll come up as green. So you end up with a heat map. And that heat map, if you're trying to make decisions, is really helpful, because very quickly you get a sense of as an institution against those metrics, where are you? And then it's about the leadership team being able to defend the red. Presumably we're not too worried about the green because the green is where we'd expect it to be. If it's amber, we have a conversation. If it's red, we need to know, one, can we justify it? Or secondly, do we need to take important steps to get us back to amber or green? Now, to navigate your way through this tool, it's very intuitive, it's very straightforward. There are a series of tabs, and you populate those tabs one step at a time. There are clear instructions. You don't have to be an accountant, you don't have to be a finance officer or a finance professional. If you've got the data, which again we give you access to some guidance on where you can extract that from, it will kick out all of the data, all of the information that you need, and help you to make informed decisions. If you want to hear more about the detail of the tool, the free training that's available on this tool, which is government sponsored, then our stand is literally just 2 booths on. So by all means go along and pick up a brochure. So that was an incredibly quick canter through school budget mastery. Hopefully in some way it was helpful, it was useful. I don't know how we are for time. We're bang on. Okay, I have to let you go. Thank you very much.